Welcome to Shady Business Podcast, where we dive into the darkest corners of human nature, unraveling some of the most chilling and mysterious true crime cases. Before we begin today's episode, we want to give a quick trigger warning. In this discussion, we'll be talking about sensitive topics such as sexual violence, trauma, abuse, etc. If these subjects are triggering or uncomfortable for you, please take care of yourself and feel free to skip this episode or listen with caution. Your well-being is important to us, and we encourage you to listen in a way that feels safe for you. I'm one of the hosts, Emily Brazel, and in this episode, we're going to explore various abduction cases with a special guest expert, Dr. P, who is a criminal justice professor at High Point University. She teaches victimology and a course on theory in serial killers. For a small time, she was a director of a sexual violence program at a nonprofit agency and trained Greek life at her alma mater in bystander intervention programming. Please welcome Dr. P.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for being here. Can you describe what kind of topics you teach?
Yeah. So you already mentioned my favorite class, which is victimology. I also am teaching this semester controlled substances. So we talk a lot about drugs and drug policy. And then I'm teaching an extra course on cults. So that's also been kind of tying into victimology, but that is this semester. And I also teach theory, like you mentioned, and gender and crime.
That's awesome. How do the topics that you teach kind of apply to the abduction cases that we're going to go over today?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So we do see a lot of the same elements, a lot of the same crimes happening within the actual crime of abduction. So we haven't gotten to it yet in victimology, but we'll definitely be covering this. We've just covered sexual assault and rape, moving into intimate partner violence. And so you'll see some of the same motivations and some of the same elements present within these, just, of course, usually with children.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what are the motivations behind someone wanting to abuse someone else?
Okay, just in general speaking, so that's a great question. So in general, most people abuse others, contrary to other myths and beliefs. It's usually just because of one thing, and that's power. So power and control are usually the motivations. Of course, depending on the crime, and specifically looking at child abductions, that can deviate a little bit, although it still centers largely around that power and control. So we'll definitely see that. And also a lot of times with these cases, you might see the extra element of that sexual motivation for sex offenders. I don't think you asked me to go into that, but I'll definitely speak really quickly about the motivations for abduction, especially with children. So most of them are going to be family-based. It's very uncommon, very, very uncommon that it's a stranger. And so when it's a parent or loved one doing so, it's usually the result of a custody battle or some intrapersonal, intrafamilial argument. So not usually as nefarious as we see in the cases that are broadcast on the news.
So what role does forensic evidence play in solving these abduction cases?
It's a good question. And that can be two ways. So I'll talk about DNA evidence, which we've seen increasing really recently, which is fantastic. We're going to see that people are able to use their familial DNA and ancestral DNA to pull cases. But a lot of these earlier cases are going to rely heavily, if the child is returned alive, on the child's interpretation of what happened. So we have a lot of forensic interviewing where we have individuals who are specifically trained in eliciting questions and feedback from often children and using that as part of the evidence. But of course, you're also going to see that DNA at play, especially in more recent cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wanted to discuss Elizabeth Smart's case. She was kidnapped at 14 years old and was abducted, and there's kind of a religion part of this. Can you describe how religion can play a role in abduction cases and what religious fanaticism is?
Yeah, sure. So religion can play a role, and of course the variations in motivation will differ, but it seemed like in that case in particular, it almost had a cultish appeal to it. When I was reading that, it definitely tuned me into that. So religious fanaticism is usually when somebody has obsessions revolving around a certain religion. Often they take their own spin on that religious aspect as well and kind of interpret it on their own. And it might be very unhealthy, as we see with Elizabeth Smart's case and her abductor. So definitely not the traditional narrative that you see with religion.
So How are abduction cases handled when there is no limited or no physical evidence?
Okay, yeah, that's going to be more challenging. A lot of the times, the first starting point is going to be looking at where that child was. So, when the last point of contact was the family had with them. And then that also can predict a lot. So, looking at where they were last seen at. And then more recently, we see this, the rise and advent of technology. Social media is becoming a huge player in these cases. So luckily, police take this very seriously, and they are more likely to ask the parents not only about where they last saw them and some of their traditional behaviors, their routines, but also to investigate that social media aspect to see if they've been communicating with anybody out of the ordinary or any unhealthy characters that might have played a role in this.
So, what are the main challenges investigators face when solving these long-term abduction cases?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So I'm looking back at some of the ones, and I'm thinking of the ones in the 90s, but I guess more recently, we do have a lot more at play. So we have the Amber Alert, which is usually utilized immediately once they know that there's been an abduction case. You've probably seen them on your phone even. And you can usually search that afterwards and see it's a familial case. So that'll make it easier. But if it's a stranger abduction, which I think is what you're kind of alluding to, those are a lot trickier. Again, I think some of the biggest challenges are going to be knowing exactly when the child went missing. So let's say that mom and dad find out it's evening time, they haven't shown up for dinner. They could have been gone for hours. So you've already lost time. And I don't want to sound scary or sad, but if the perpetrator is a stranger and they have a sexual or violent motivation, the child is likely to be killed within the first 3 hours of being abducted. So I think time is of the essence, and that is probably one of the strongest weaknesses, I guess you would say, in terms of finding that child and knowing where to go from there. But it will be a lot harder if there is no social media evidence, no video or CCTV footage, anything like that to go on to trace those last steps. It's going to be a lot more challenging.
Right. So, what psychological impact do abduction experiences have on victims? And can you give an example of that?
Yeah, good question again. So a lot of these are going, if the victim survives, which is ideally the case, they're going to, in most cases, suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, which is characterized by a lot of flashbacks, fear of that event happening again, avoidance behaviors. And that's only touching the smallest part of it, right? They might have experienced Stockholm syndrome, where they kind of attach to their attacker, the perpetrator of their crime. And it's kind of a psychological protective mechanism. But they're definitely going to suffer from some psychological disorders in the wake of victimization. And that can vary naturally depending on the person. PTSD, again, is common, depression, anxiety, and then maybe Stockholm syndrome as well.
Yeah, so when it comes to laws and policies, how effective are they on child and adult abduction cases?
Yeah, that can vary. So the one case I want to talk about later kind of spurred one of the more recent policies we see, especially in California, and so that's more punishment-based, and that's the 3 strikes laws. So that has some really great aspects to it, but we also see individuals who have 3 felonies being incarcerated for 25 years to life when those felonies might not be as violent. So that has helped in some cases. We also have Megan Kanka. I don't know if you've heard that name, but her case, she was not necessarily abducted per se in the traditional sense, but she was taken and she was raped and murdered by her neighbor. Nobody knew that he had a past, specifically with offending against children. And so that gave us a lot in terms of the Sex Offender Registration Notification Act. So now you can, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, you can go log onto your computer, go on your phone, and search for sex offenders in the area. So that's one law we see. We have the Amber Alerts. So those are, of course, going to be dedicated to cases where the child is believed to be abducted, especially by non-familial cases, though you usually do see those that are family-oriented in there as well. So you kind of have this advent in the resources you have to, investigate, and those that are at your disposal are going to be really helpful in getting to the answer quickly. So those are some of the ones I commonly think of. I don't know if you have any others in mind that you were thinking of too.
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
But like how often or like rare does it happen when like someone gets like a death penalty?
Oh, that is a good question. I don't know. And so that would only be in the case of premeditated murder.
Okay.
So only if the victim is not returned alive.
Gotcha.
And they can prove that it was premeditated with malice aforethought. That's going to give you the death penalty. And that's only in cases states that have the death penalty on the table. So that can also limit it. So I don't have a direct number. But the fact of the matter is that 99.8% of children, I found it earlier, statistic that states that most of those children are coming home if they're reported missing. Unfortunately, there are about 100 every year that are abducted by strangers, and those can result in really devastating consequences, with about half of them resulting in murder. So I don't have the exact number, but those are probably going to be more likely to reach the death penalty because it involved a child, and in many cases it was horrific nature.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. I actually wanted to ask you, have you been keeping up with the Menendez case?
A little bit. My students just asked me that today. They've been watching it. I have not watched the new series, but I know a little bit about the case and the abuse that they endured from their parents, allegedly, right?
Yeah, so like what are your thoughts on it, and like how do you think like the media portrays these kind of cases, like whether it's the Menendez case or like the Gypsy Rose case or Dahmer series? Like how do you think the media portrays that?
That is great. It's kind of a loaded question in some sense, because I'm thinking, okay, it's great, but also there's some really negative aspects of it too. So looking at the Menendez brothers, I think from the early stages, a lot of the focus was on them as killers, and they didn't really see them as human beings. Sometimes the media can do that. Gypsy Rose Blanchard, I think that case became so popular, especially recently on TikTok, with her speaking out on there. But again, they can kind of glorify the violence, and I think sometimes, you know, that's the nature in some cases where they kind of follow the leads and they want the most exciting cases. I think sometimes the victims and the individuals get lost in those stories. So as far as I know, and I am not an expert in the Menendez case, but I'm not sure the abuse they suffered was widely recognized at first. So I'm not sure if that was the focal point, if they even knew about it at the time. But it can really, I think it does have some great purposes, though. So, for example, while I never want to exploit a victim and their stories, I think that it's really powerful to have them, at least their stories, out there for people to see. And also, at least as a professor, I see a lot of students kind of flocking towards crim classes because they are interested after watching some of those docuseries, documentaries, even some of the fictional series that they watch. So I can kind of see both sides of that being really great. I also have a lot of respect for journalists, especially those that are interested in crime, because they often are kind of the first ones at the scene that give us the insight. And with social media, we see that, right? Gabby Petito's case, that kind of, that was so crazy. It spurred a whole new social media movement where people were sharing information about true crime. And that I don't think has slowed down yet. So just kind of a focus still on true crime media. And it can be really great, but again, it has its downfalls.
Right, yeah, because I was hearing a lot for the Menendez case that Ryan Murphy, the director, wasn't, let's just say, wasn't portraying the characters as well as they wanted it to. So there was definitely a lot of controversy against that. But yeah, that's, very interesting. Do you have any like other cases that you want to discuss? Yeah. Go ahead.
So I don't know if you heard of polyclass, either of you?
I have not.
No? Okay. So my students hadn't either today, and I was like, oh no, we have to go do a deep dive of this. I stumbled upon it by listening to a podcast. So I definitely want to shout the podcast out, which is True Crime News. And Anna Garcia is the host. She's an investigative journalist, and she also had Kim Cross on that episode. And Kim Cross, her father-in-law was one of the FBI agents who was investigating the case. So I'll just briefly summarize it so I don't, But it was in 1993, and Polly Klaas was 12 years old. It was October 1st, I believe. She really wanted to have a slumber party, and her room was a mess. So her mom was like, you have to clean your room. It was a big deal for her. She really went into that and cleaned it. She was so excited to have her two friends over. So something that's lost a lot in the media, I think it kind of got pushed aside, or maybe people just didn't know about it, is that her mom had a migraine that night. So she actually took a strong medication and a sleeping aid to let her sleep through the migraine. So she didn't hear any of this. And at 10:30 at night, this guy came in to their house, and the girls always played jokes on each other. This would be a really extreme joke, but they thought they were just playing a joke because he came in and he said, "I've got a knife." He was bearded. That's how they described him. And he said, "I'm going to tie you up now, and you're going to count to 1,000. If you don't count to 1,000, I'm going to slit your throat." I'm sorry, that's so graphic. And so the two girls that were Polly's friends obliged with his request. They counted for a while, probably not to 1,000, and then they realized something was seriously amiss, and Polly was gone when they woke up. So they went and told Polly's mom, and this 911 call, I actually didn't listen to it, but I've heard it's received a lot of criticism because she, I guess, was kind of like tired and not as urgent as you'd expect a mother to be if their child was missing. So I think that also can be a point of contention with reviewing 911 calls. But again, she just had taken a sleep aid. Mm-hmm. So about an hour later, the same man is spotted, but nobody knows this yet. So he's spotted. This was in Palermo County, I believe, California. And they find him, I think, it's Petaluma, California.
You're good.
So it's in Petaluma, California, where that happened. And he was found in between, I think, Santa Clara and somewhere else. And so it was roughly a 21-minute drive. I looked it up. So he's found there at midnight, and he doesn't have her with him. The officers who respond to the call, so basically what happens is a babysitter is leaving Dana's house, and she sees this weird man. So she calls the mom up and says, "Hey, there's this weird guy here. Just well, that you should know." So mom leaves with her kids and goes and calls 911. The police officers that respond, they don't know that there's a child missing in a neighboring county. There's an APB, all points bulletin, on the lookout for this guy, but it hasn't been made available to the neighboring counties. And also they're not using the right radio code at the time to hear the other neighbors. So they don't know. They let him go after looking through his license and registration, and there's no warrants out for his arrest. And then there's some tips that come and go. Some are quite devastating. He actually was arrested for a DUI in between then and the capture. So he's been in contact with law enforcement twice now. But then what happens is the neighbor I mentioned, or the lady, who lived there, that house, her name was Dana. She was out for a walk, and she saw red leggings in the brush, and then she kind of pulled it apart and looked further, and they were little girl leggings, and there was also knotted hair and these white cords. So the girls that had been tied up and told to count to 1,000, they were bound with Nintendo cords, so they knew it wasn't a prank because nobody would cut those, especially then. So she brings that in, and then eventually, I forget exactly how, but they figure out who he is. He is arrested. He does confess, but it's interesting because he keeps confessing, like, "Yes, I strangled her. I'll take you to her body." And the one podcaster, her last name's Cross, her father-in-law was the one who found the body. So that's quite devastating for him. And there was another investigator there who really believed in spirituality. It's so sad, but he sat next to her body and told her, like, "Hey, we're taking you home now," because she was afraid of the dark. So it was a really devastating case. It really did inspire this movement of volunteers, though. So we see that 4,000 volunteers came together, which was a lot at that time. They printed out flyers. They were photocopying them and leaving them all around. And even there was a celebrity, I don't know if you guys want to take a guess, in the 1990s. You were probably not even born yet. I was pretty young. So I don't know if you could think of like any celebrities. She's on Stranger Things, if that helps. Winona Ryder, yeah. Yeah, so she is the first celebrity to pay attention to a case like this, and she offers a $20,000 reward for information. So that was really unique. And then essentially he does go to trial. He has confessed, but then he recants later on. And he is charged with a death penalty, so he does receive that death sentence. He's still on death row, though, because California halted their executions right now. So he's waiting. And one of the more egregious parts of this case is that while he was in court, he was flicking off the family members. He was smirking and like shouting really inappropriate things at them. So the judge was more than happy to hand that sentence down. And so, yeah, that's the case of Polly Klaas. It's very sad.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
very
rough.
sad.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, and then I think I mentioned earlier, but they have that policy that came out after that, which is the 3 strikes law. And California and some other states have adopted it as well. So basically, if somebody commits 3 felonies, upon their 3rd felony, they are sentenced to a period of 25 years to life in prison. And the whole point of that was to try and keep predators like this guy, his name was, Richard Allen Davis, to keep him and others like him off the streets. So it's kind of had a big legacy.
Wow. So when they order a death penalty, like how does that process work?
Yeah, so they can sentence somebody to essentially execution by the death penalty, but they usually will be on death row for quite a long time. They have a number of attempts at appeals that they're allowed to go through. They also will, of course, look to see if there's other evidence that comes forward in that time. And so I think traditionally it's much quicker, but this was in 1993. So we're talking about, 31 years approximately, and he's still sitting there. But again, since the state has halted executions right now and has a moratorium, I believe at this moment, they're not going to do anything. So he just sits and waits basically until that's lifted, and then they can review the facts of his case again. And if no other information comes out, then eventually they'll schedule a date of execution.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Wow.
I know.
That's crazy. All right. So as we're wrapping up, is there any other information or socials that you would like to share?
Yes. So I don't have a social for the group that's doing this. It's my class this semester. So I have a victimology class, my favorite. We have a service learning class for the first time. So they have to go out and commute. Oh, my God. Sorry. They have to go out and serve 25 hours in the community with our partner, which is the Family Justice Center. So we have some mini projects, but the big one I want to promote is Take Back the Night. It is a march that is meant to raise awareness of victimization, garner support from the community to victims and survivors of violent crime, and just really spread the awareness and education about these crimes and what and connect victims and survivors with resources like the Family Justice Center. So that's going to be October 17th. Which is a Thursday night at 7 o'clock p.m.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And then also, it's not mine, but I was talking with some of my students, and Alpha Chi Omega is hosting the domestic violence awareness speaker, Denise Brown, and that is the sister of the late Nicole Simpson Brown. So I wanted to raise awareness for that, too. That's the day before, October 16th, I believe, at 5:30 at the Cottrell Amphitheater. So I hope everybody comes to both of those events.
Yes, and she is going to be our next speaker on our podcast.
Oh, my goodness.
So that is super exciting.
Wow.
Yep.
I want to follow her. I'm glad.
All right. So thank you so much,
Yeah.
Dr. P, for your insights and expertise. And thank you to our listeners. I hope you enjoyed our conversation and found it insightful. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe, share it with a friend, and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. And as always, feel free to connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, which is at Shady Business Pod. We'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, and ideas for future episodes. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next week, we'll be diving into the O.J. Simpson case with Denise Brown, sister of the late Nicole Brown, who tragically lost her life. We'll catch you next time on Shady Business.